remind me, I want to share a little extra piece of scripture with you as we go through. The lesson writer talks about us as parents and, our children imitating our strengths, and a lot of times they imitate our weaknesses also. And we would rather them imitate all our good parts of us and not the bad parts. Often I see children that, have picked up habits of their parents, and many times those habits are not good habits. A lot of times when you see a parent that's a smoker, a lot of times you'll see a child that's a smoker because they picked that up from, and I'm just using that as an example, but we feel proud when they do good and they do those good things that we've taught them. But, we have an influence over our kids. God does not shape his children without their consent. We can't force, especially when they get to adulthood, we can't force our children to do what we want them to do. Neither does God do the same thing. We can say, hey, here's some good advice. We can give them advice all day long. Now, whether they take it or not, usually I put it to them as, well, have you thought about thus and such? And then, after a while, maybe they come around and they say, I've had my son tell me, Dad, I didn't realize how hard it was to make a living. He began to appreciate, having to clothe and feed and put Patrick into school, into private school, so he gets the best education that he can, and stuff like that. So, all of a sudden the light bulb come on, and I appreciated, him coming back and saying, man, I didn't know how hard it was. You got to be on the top of your game, and you got to get it done to make that kind of money to do that, to pay those house payments, car payments, things like that. But we as children of God, many times we fall short. We don't fully comprehend his provision. We don't fully comprehend what he does for us. We're supposed to try to follow the example that he has set. Be holy because I am holy. And that's from Leviticus 11:45. And it's a reference to Leviticus 19:2 and 20:26, and 1 Peter 1:15 and 16. Part of what we're going to be talking about today is the sanctity of life. Every year the Baptists try to focus one Sunday in January on the sanctity of life. And, to uphold not only children, unborn babies, but about some of us adults. We're getting there, We're getting older and older. And as we get there, if you look at it from a dollars and cents standpoint, at one point there was a move like, well, if they're totally out of it, why not just go ahead and just get rid of them, And a lot of people have pushed back on that. There were several cases a few years back about where this doctor was allowing people to hit the button and euthanize themselves, So it all comes back to that, being children of God. One of the things that they suggested for the session in the book, the teacher's book here, was to bring in pictures of you when you were young. And I thought, Oh, we might not ever get through the lesson at all. We get to look into all these pictures of all these people. But and the lesson writer says that parents are excited to hear their children's first words, especially when those first words are mama or daddy. Not all words, though, can cause elation. Seemingly, children soon learn two other words, which they say with much conviction. No. You probably see that in your job, Christian. There's a lot of them. No. No. All the time. And then the other thing is, teaching them to share. And why is that? Why do kids, they come out, they come out like that? As soon as they talk, they say, no. And I thought about...
that's what they hear a lot.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah.
No, don't do that.
Yeah,
My
they
puppy
hear.
even knows that word.
Yeah.
But I thought about when the youngest grandson, Nick, was he was learning to talk, and we went for a visit, and she was trying to get him to say Mimi. He wouldn't say Mimi for nothing. He'd look right at her and call her mama. And finally, one day, he said, my Mimi. I thought, she said, you little rascal. All this time, I've been trying to get him to say Mimi. Isn't that the way God is? A lot of times, he wants us to say, my Father. And instead, we won't focus on who he is. But it seems like, the little ones, when they're born, they come out and they've just got that, thing ingrained in them to say no, or to say no, mine, mine. He asks, what keeps people from being generous? When was a time you've seen somebody be very generous? I'll get it out in a second. What emotions arise when you see generosity? I would like to be out at the blessing box sometimes and see the people's faces when they come up and actually start getting food and see.
Like a spider on a wall where they don't know it's you.
Yeah, they don't know it's you. But I would like to see, are they getting a hand up? Are they getting a hand out? Are we pulling them up? That's the kind of things that go through my mind. All right, let's talk a little bit about our context. We've been studying last week. We talked about the first delivery of the Ten Commandments, and the ratification ceremony in Exodus 24, where Moses read the book of life and the covenant to the people in Exodus 24:7. And the covenant scroll contained the foundational decalogue elaborated by other covenant terms or ordinances introduced in 21:1. These stipulations dealt with Hebrew slaves, cases of personal injury. Exodus 22 focuses on cases of theft, crop protection, personal property, seduction, 3 capital offenses, and then verses 18 through 20, protecting the vulnerable, 21 through 27, and the respect for God, 28 through 31. The rest of the book of the covenant related to issues of honesty and justice, Sabbath observance, and worship at the 3 annual festivals. One of the things I wanted to go back in verse 24 and 9. This is not in the quarterly. It says, Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of sapphire, clear as the sky itself. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, and they ate and drank. And I have puzzled over this one quite a bit. And the only thing I was able to come up with was in the Matthew Henry commentary. It said it doesn't indicate that they actually physically saw God, but they gives an indication that they saw where he was standing. So they saw his glory. Now, I'm open to anybody else. If you go, your homework can be go and research this and find out, see if you find anything else that gives us any indication, because I've always heard, as long as I've been in church and stuff like that and preaching, that nobody could see God and live. Mm-hmm. So, and I didn't send this to Kenny. I knew he was probably studying, but I probably should have, because.
And if you read that.
24:9, chapter
that,
24.
Okay, that's verse 9. I heard 24. I thought it was verse 24.
Yeah, go ahead.
That description of the glass and the sapphire, that same description is in Revelations. Mm-hmm. So it's true.
Matches.
And it is God's glory.
So, that was, but it gives an indication of where he was standing, or his glory was standing, and maybe he was shrouded in the cloud or covered in the fire or whatever. It doesn't give us a lot of details here.
It goes back to aluminum oxide. The more you heat it, the more it turns into sapphire in different colors and all. And they say with the heat of God, wherever he puts his foot or his soul touch, it's like turns to an amber, an emerald, or the red sapphire. It depends on the heat from God, what he touches, and it calls from aluminum oxide when you overheat it.
So I don't know how all this looked, Brian. I just know what it says here in Exodus. It doesn't give me a whole lot more information there, and this is one of those things that when I read something like this, I puzzle my puzzle until my puzzler can't puzzle anymore. I'm kind of like the Grinch. I think about it and I think about it and I think about it, and it just my puzzler just gets befuddled. So, okay. It does say at the end of that, they ate. So evidently they had some kind of a meal there, and evidently they, at the next verse it says that God said to Moses, "Come up on the mountain with me." And then later that's when they started. They made the golden calf because he was up there for 40 days and 40 nights. And as I thought about, now wait a minute, they just ratified the covenant and everything, and then within 40 days, they're worshiping golden calf. Mm-hmm. They didn't remember very long, did they? Okay. So, all right, let's move on to our scripture where we can get finished here.
That mimics life too. So
I'm sorry?
it mimics life. You think about humans.
We say, we go to the buffet and say, I'm not going to ever eat that much again. And then next time we go to the buffet, guess what? You walk out and say, I ate too much. We don't remember it. We just remember how good it is. And I think in the case of the Israelites, they remembered what it was like in Egypt, worshiping all these idols and having a big party. And so they went back to what they knew. We had such a good time when we were in Egypt. We had plenty of food. We don't know if Moses is ever coming back down off that mountain. God may have killed him already. You can just kind of hear it, if you step in their shoes. Okay, exploitation. Somebody want to read that? 21 through 24.
Do not mistreat any or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will arouse, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless.
So these are part of the instructions that he's given. And, the lesson right has something about key concept. The Lord provides careful instructions that direct us on the path that reflects his character. The Bible refers to this many times as walking in his ways. And a scripture reference of Deuteronomy 10, 12, 11, 22, 19 and 9, 28 and 9, and then Isaiah 2, 3. We reflect his character only by loving him and others and by obeying his commands. This includes being his hands and feet, by standing up for those who are defenseless, because we recognize their value as people created in the image of God. We're all created in the image of God. And it goes on this, the lesson I talk some about, mistreat and oppress, and God's character demands his wrath against mistreat or oppress the helpless. The two Hebrew words here describe the wicked and powerful who take from the poor, usually by force or deception. The Egyptians had pressed Israel. This, along with their idolatry, is why God humiliated them. The Lord's way counters human logic. Instead of dominating the weak, he demands that his people, care about others and zealously protect them from the individual who would prey on their inability to fight back. The foreigners, the Hebrew term for foreigner can be rendered refugee or immigrants. It refers to landless residents who were not Israelites and had limited rights. The group would have been distinguished from an outsider whose residence was less permanent and whose connection was more tenuous. He reminds them in verse 21 also, you were foreigners in the land in Egypt. So the motivation for you showing mercy is found repeatedly in the Old Testament. God rescued Israel from the landless slavery and oppression and gave them a land of great abundance. So they went from being slaves, they didn't own anything. They owned the houses, they didn't own anything. It kind of reminds you of, the old South where, slaves were considered property. And I feel sure that the Egyptians felt that they were their property. They did all the work. And if you remember, even at the last, when they were crossing the Red Sea, Pharaoh and his advisors all of a sudden said, what have we done? We've let all our labor force go. They've all split. And, we're going to have to do the work now. We don't want to do that. Widows and fatherless, landless people included the widow and the fatherless, unprotected and dependent on the benevolence of others. Israelites were commanded to be generous towards them. I will certainly hear, my anger will be aroused. God heard the cries of his people in Egypt, and he executed his fierce anger against the Egyptians. In our society today, who are the most vulnerable people in our culture?
The poor.
Poor?
The most
Poor?
And that could cover a lot of say poor, I mean, that could be all kinds of folks.
People that are down and out and are on the street for whatever reason.
I'm looking at the situation we're in today. We've had foreigners move into our country now. They walk across the border, they come in our country. Therefore, they don't have anything, so we're supposed to take care of them. I mean, that's what it's saying. But are they willing to accept our culture and our beliefs and our ways of doing things here? But it seems as if they're wanting to bring what they came from to our nation. So how are we supposed to react to something like that when we're just saying, you know, it just crossed my mind, we're supposed to treat strangers in a kind and loving way? But are we supposed to just neglect what we're doing just to what we have to not change them to what we believe?
I mean, look at the Bible though. I mean, you had people in the Bible that converted
Yes,
and
that's what I'm saying.
tried to become part of the culture.
Yeah.
And then you had the people that fought it, and the Bible's full of battles and death
Yeah.
and conquering and actually wiping entire groups out. Not
I mean,
telling them, men, women, and children, gone. Take them out.
well,
I
I
mean,
come in
it's
this world.
wild when you read
I
just
come
how,
in this world knowing not to mistreat anybody.
yeah.
You know, you're not supposed to mistreat anybody, culture, wherever they come from.
Yeah.
Treat them as kind as you can and tell others the ways are shown different, you know. So I'm just looking at that. I mean, we're in a crisis right now. What is this? To get rid of the ones that's doing the bad things first in our
Yeah.
country. That's the way I
We
see
gotta
it.
sort who wants to be a
Yeah.
part and who wants to be against.
Yeah,
That's our job. That's gonna be the job of the future, is
that's it.
trying to
Find
figure
out
out what do we have, who wants to be here and wants to be a part of this, and let them ingrain themselves into it. I'm not against. Even
Well,
somebody
you
that came
know.
across illegal, I'm not against them.
Well, there
But-
again, when we talk about slavery and everything like that, when we first started having Mexicans come to our country, all the construction guys was wanting to get the Mexicans because they were working cheaper.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody would hire an American.
So it
They
was
were telling me,
financial and whatever.
their philosophy
All right.
for me for painting was, if they can paint this house, well, you can paint two houses for the price of one.
Mhm.
I'm saying they don't have the expenses that I have. They're living on something else.
But then you come back to
There-
abusing, but then you come back to what it talks about,
Yeah.
taking advantage.
Taking advantage
the
of it.
poor.
A lot
That's
of them
taking
did.
advantage
They
of the
really
poor.
took advantage of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now
So,
they have come
and
up
many
and learned it.
many times, people that have money
Mhm.
are hiring them and not paying them a decent wage,
Mhm.
and then that's where they're taking advantage of. And I think that's what this is speaking to, is not giving them a fair chance or a fair wage, whether they got ever how they got here, irregardless, they're here, whether they, and you know, I've got mixed emotions as far as, you know, some of the illegals and stuff like that, but do we treat them, you know, when you go out into out in the public and you see a Hispanic, do you treat them like you would anyone else? And I think that's a lot of what this is speaking to.
That's what I'm saying. Still gotta treat
Okay.
them, but then there's a lot of them out there mistreating them, but
All right.
I kind of weave through the good and the bad myself. You
We-
stay away from that crowd, or you can go in that crowd. And see,
We-
It all comes down to using common sense, and sometimes
Using
common
common
sense.
sense.
Exactly.
Goes out the
Okay.
window.
All right, we got to move on. We can beat this one. You know, we get on the subject of immigration and stuff like that.
Yeah.
We can beat this one for hours and hours.
Right.
And you know, I think, you know, if we use a little common sense on it, then we'll be good.
Yeah.
We treat them with dignity. We don't take advantage of them. Then we're good. Now, all right, let's go on to the next section. Lending practices. Somebody want to read that?
I'll read it. Let's get my glasses on here. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate.
Okay. He talks about, unfair financial practices was another way that powerful individuals could exploit those who are weaker. God provided special instructions for dealing with my people, and he left no doubt about how Israelites should treat other Israelites. Now, I can tell you, if you go to Wells Fargo or wherever and say, I'd like to get a loan, they're going to charge you interest. They don't care who you are, because that's the way they make money. So, having been in the banking industry, but what gets me is thing on a retail business credit card, and it says your APR is 25%. That's taking advantage of people. My opinion, but that is taking advantage of people to use a credit card, and it's just wrong, It's bad.
Common sense kicks in, not to deal with that,
Yeah, if you go take the car
But-
out to save the money, then you pay it off totally at the end of the month.
You can pay it off at the end of and when the statement comes. However, something happens, you don't have the money to pay it off. That's me. That's where I get, grit in my craw that just don't settle right. But it says not to treat it like a business deal. It did not prohibit lending or borrowing. It just says don't treat it like a business deal. Don't charge interest. Positive incentives were offered, such as Proverbs 19:17, which states that showing kindness to the poor is like giving the Lord a loan. Now, how many times, we're not probably in the lending business, but how many times have you ever, comes up and says, hey man, I need $10 really bad. You think you could spare 10, and you're probably not going to get it back. But, you help the person out. When you see a person on the street, and they're like, man, I need some money for some food, or,
I knew a homeless woman one time. She'd come visit me every day. She'd want money. I couldn't give her money because she would go buy little bottles of liquor.
yeah,
But I would go by McDonald's and bring her something to eat.
food.
Food.
Give her
I
some
couldn't give her
food.
money, but I could give her food.
Right. I've seen people at service stations, man, can you spare a few dollars to give me some gas? When we were out in Arizona year before last, this, I guess he was like, Native American Indian, or that's what he looked like. He said, man, could you spare a few dollars to put some gas in? I said, you don't have any money? He said, no, we're totally out of money. And I said, where are you trying to get to? He said, we're trying to get back to Phoenix. So I put him some gas in there. I don't mind doing something like that, because it's pretty hard to get gas back out of there. And they may have had the money, I don't know, but between them and God at that point, I just did what he led me to do. It talks about the pledge of the coat. Don't take the man's cloak and keep it as a pledge. They would do that kind of like as a security. That's another term for it, and I can't remember. It won't come out right now. To keep them from. Collateral. Yeah. It was a collateral, and the results of that loss of the collateral, something valuable that covers the loan. Well, how was he supposed to sleep? at nighttime with no blanket, no cloak, no nothing to take care of him and cover him, he might freeze to death and you still wouldn't get your money. So, it prohibited you keeping his cloak. Now, you might come back by the next morning and say, hey, I've got a job for you to do, and I'm going to pay you, but I need your cloak as security deposit still. And you keep the cloak during the daytime while he works for you, and you give it back to him at nighttime. That's in my mind the way they would work it, but.
But, they still, you look on the TV, all these people, these title maxes that tell you that,
Get your title back.
Yeah, and they're charging 50% interest. They get their money, they can't pay it back, they come get your car.
Yeah.
They don't have a car.
Yeah.
I don't know why they should be allowed to operate.
The thing is they are a business. They're not Christians. So.
No,
Yeah.
no,
And they're not following principles that.
No, they are not following principles.
So
of
they
God.
essentially are taking advantage of.
That with the car business was not a big issue, but I've seen people paying child support, be it a woman or a man that's had to pay child support, got in tough times. Instead of seeing if they couldn't work something out with them to pay the child support, they'd lock them up in jail, and that way they could not get to a job, it would not work.
and there was nothing.
But then when they're released from the jail for their little time spent, they were charged interest on the money that they owed for child support and child care, and they had no way of ever paying it back. And I said, where has our society gone wrong here? They can't.
Well, that's society.
That was society. That's what the
Society.
people said.
Yeah.
It's not the Christian
That would
church.
just hurt me out.
IRS is the same way.
I know.
Let's see if we get started on that, okay?
Y'all just gonna be the
All right.
divorce.
We got to let's put a cap on that and let's move on. Reaping crops. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleaning of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. And as I was thinking about this, I can remember my grandfather had, a big corn picker. And it wouldn't get all the corn, it would leave some. And there was a black gentleman that would come, and he would get his little Kroger sack and his thing around his neck, and he would go out through there where the corn had been picked, and he would find the corn that was missed by the picker. The tractor knocked it down accidentally, or it was a stalk that fell over, and it'd get picked up. So he would come behind and he would glean, and he would have sacks of corn that would otherwise, my grandfather wouldn't have gone back and picked it up. Otherwise, it would just lay there. So he was gleaning that field and picking up, and if I'm not mistaken, he was using that to feed pigs. So he would take it and put it in the barn and then use it to feed pigs and feed them out for them to have meat.
In an older time, that was normal. 'Cause I remember my grandfather draining a pond one time, and he had a 55-gallon drum. He threw all the carp in that 55-gallon drum, and there were some that were
Huge.
2 feet, 3 feet
Yeah.
long. They were giant. And he kept the bass or anything else that he pulled out of the pond as it drained. And he had all the poor folks in the area come to that 55-gallon drum, and they'd grab. Carp were great for them. They didn't say they were bony. They wanted them. And that was just normal. You helped.
You helped other people out. All right, he talks about, the holiness. Scholars often refer to Leviticus 17:26 as the holiness code. Holiness involves qualities such as uniqueness, separateness, purity, and devotion. It represents a major theme in the book of Leviticus. God calls his people to be holy because he is holy. Places like the burning bush, the Mount Sinai, the tabernacle, and the temple, the times like the Sabbath, festivals are called holy since they represent God's presence and offer his people the opportunity to worship him. items and persons can be holy because they are devoted to his service. Leviticus 19:9 through 10 emphasize the practical side of holiness, offering dignity to the helpless and defending the sanctity of life. Human life are prime examples of holiness in a fallen world. And it goes on and talks about when you reap, not to reap to the edge of the fields, to leave some. And if you go back and look, that was in the story of Ruth and Boaz. That was how she became acquainted. She went out to glean the fields, and Boaz saw her, and he liked her, just to put it mildly. But he liked her, so he told his people, that the workers that were working for him, leave some extra for her to get, so that she'll have enough to feed herself and her mother-in-law. And when he found the whole story, we know that if you're familiar with the story of Ruth, you know that eventually Boaz married her. You know, he redeemed the kinsman redeemer. So, you know, you were to leave some at the edges. The same thing with the grapes. You were to leave the extra in the vineyard so the poor could come in and glean through and get the extra grapes. And at the end of verse 10, he says, I am the Lord. And it says, he was the source and the standard for their actions. As noted, he defined holiness because he is holy. And the lesson writer asks, what keeps us from sharing our surplus with those in need? A lot of us not farmers these days, but, you know.
I would say if you don't share what you've got or have, you're not really trusting in God to, you know, provide.
You know, now years back when, you know, my mom and dad's generation, where there was primarily a lot of people had farming and gardens and stuff like that. If they had surplus, you know, they would share it with the neighbors or share it with somebody else. And to a certain extent, I've done the same thing. One year I planted cabbage. I had a dozen cabbage, and those things were that big around, and they were the best tasting cabbage you'd ever seen. And I called a lady that was going to our church and said, would you like some cabbage? She said, oh yeah, I'd like one. I said, because I asked her, I said, how many would you like? She said, one would be enough. Well, it was so big that she gave half of it to a friend of hers because they couldn't eat it all. So, you know, but that went on a regular basis, you know, years back in the farming communities and stuff like that. And that's why a lot of times the farmers always had something to eat because they grew everything. They, you know, grew their crops.
We got on this conversation a week ago with my daughter, and I said, when we were growing up, we had a milk cow. She'd get 2 gallons of milk every time we milked her in the afternoon. And we had big mouth glass jars, you know, and they were set up. Nobody would have plastic. We had them jars. We put 3 or 4 gallons at the refrigerator at a time, and the neighbors would come by and get milk. They would get eggs. They would get milk. And Lord, when they got in the meat box, they was in heaven. But, you know, it's just something. You share it like that?
How do we share today?
I do it now. If I got something I don't need, I let it go.
You know, how do we share it today? And I thought about the blessing box out front. That's a way that we share with the community. We don't know who they are, and we just have to trust that what we're putting in there. But evidently the need was a lot greater than we realized because, you know, once they discovered it, then, you know, on a regular basis, it goes down pretty quickly. And, you know, and I got to wondering, you know, where do people go to get it? You know, if they're down and out, where do they go to get food? You know, and I did a quick Google, you know, the Coweta County has a food pantry. LaGrange has a food pantry. There's Peachtree City, there's Midwest Food Bank. There's actually
Up at Noonan that does a food bank on, I think it's every Friday.
one roof does a food distribution, and I looked. There's one in Pike County, it's a Real Life Center in Tyrone, and then I mentioned one roof. But one of the unique ones I thought was the online food pantry. So you have to go in online and had a link to the website and stuff like that. I had not run across that before, so I thought that was interesting.
You know, I've never been hungry. That I can honestly say. I've never been hungry.
I've never
Because
been
I know
hungry before.
everywhere I've ever
You
been.
can look at me and tell I hadn't been hungry, Brian.
You can go in somebody's house. I mean, it used to be you just walk in, there's food there. Come on, have some food, have some food. You know, you gotta eat. Come on, eat.
When we grew up, the only reason we weren't hungry is because people helped us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We had people to help us.
Yeah.
And people, we helped each other. This community used to be, the welfare was if somebody had without or they were sick, everybody in the community was carrying them something.
Yeah.
Doing something for them. And now when the government started over in the 60s the way it did, it got blown out of proportion. And when you carried somebody something and they would say, I don't want that, I ain't gotta have that, I got it coming in. Like, whoa.
I guess I'll keep it for myself then.
Yeah, you know, somebody else will need it.
Okay, we need to wrap up here real quick. Keep some of this in mind that, there are people out there that are vulnerable. We need to make sure that we care for those that are vulnerable, those that, we need to offer some dignity to those in need and physically help those that are in need. It may not be just food. It might be other things that they need. Maybe their electric bill needs to be paid, to help them out or something like that.
And the one thing that we've got to fight though, because this has happened twice to me, I can remember, is that one time they'd gone by and got me a hamburger, and I'm sitting at the traffic light, and this guy's staring, work for food. Roll my window down, I'm gonna hand him the whole bag I bought. He goes, no, I want money. I don't want that, I want money. Well, your sign says work for food. Don't you want the hamburger? No, want money. That tainted me a little bit. And the same thing happened. We used to buy Christmas for a lady that, for her kids at Candy New. And what really turned me off is one year she goes, I need all those receipts. You need to give me all the receipts of all the stuff you bought.
Take it back.
And I go, no.
We just don't have the receipts.
We don't have the receipts. And that, you gotta fight that too, because that can taint you to where to somebody that really does need your help.
Yeah.
And that's tough.
Well, you need to rely on God,
Yeah.
that you're not tainted,
Yeah.
that you did the right thing, and then just go on.
And use discretion, because
Yeah.
there are those that's their job.
Yeah.
They're on the corner because
okay.
that's their job, but anyway.
Let's wrap this up. Say prayer. And if y'all want to keep discussion, you can, because I know Bones has got to get on the sound system or lead the music. You got to get on the sound system. So I don't want to, and I know you're gonna have some wild Indians running around, Kristen. So let's pray together. Dear Lord, we thank you for this lesson. We thank you that you brought to our attention that there are people out there that are vulnerable. Father, we ask you would give us a spirit of discernment when it comes to helping people, that we would realize when we see somebody that's really in need and down and out, that we would reach out to them and help them and give them the love that you would have us give them. Give them substance that you would have us give them. We ask all